There's a moment in tennis, rare and unmistakable, when a legend stops mid-sentence in a press conference to talk not about his own match, not his own record, not his own legacy, but about someone else entirely. Someone younger. Someone still climbing. That's exactly what happened when Novak Djokovic, 24-time Grand Slam champion, 10-time Australian Open winner, a man who has played in front of every kind of crowd in every corner of the tennis world, sat down after his second-round win at the 2026 Australian Open and chose, without much prompting, to talk about Alex Eala. The young Filipina had just walked off court 6 after a first-round exit, and yet somehow left behind a bigger footprint than most players leave after winning a title. That contradiction, a first-round loss creating a bigger story than most quarter-final wins, is exactly the kind of thing worth unpacking slowly, piece by piece. On the surface, it looks like a simple quote from a champion being generous to a rising star. Underneath it, there's a much bigger story about what tennis is becoming, about who gets to be a star in this sport, about how a country with essentially no tennis history can suddenly produce a name that fills a court meant for far smaller matches, and about why Djokovic, of all people, a man who's built his entire career on cold precision and relentless self-belief, looked at Alex Eala and didn't see a threat. Didn't see distraction, but saw something worth talking about publicly, unprompted, in his own words. That respect is the real headline here, more than any single quote, because respect from Djokovic isn't handed out casually. It's earned, and Alex Eala earned it not by winning the match. She lost that match, but by doing something that mattered more in the long run. She moved a room. She moved thousands of people who had never watched a professional tennis match in their life before that day. She moved a diaspora that had been waiting decades for a name to attach their pride to. And she did it on the biggest stage in Australian sport during the first week of the year, when every eye in the tennis world is pointed at Melbourne Park. So let's start from the beginning, because to understand why Djokovic said what he said, you have to understand who Alex Eala actually is. Not the headline version, not the clickbait version, the real one, built over years of quiet, grinding work far away from cameras. Alex Eala didn't appear out of nowhere. She wasn't discovered in some viral video. She was built deliberately, patiently, the way real champions are built. Sent as a young teenager from the Philippines to Rafael Nadal's academy in Manacor, Mallorca, a place designed to strip away comfort and replace it with structure, discipline, and repetition. Thousands of hours of drills, footwork patterns, mental conditioning, the unglamorous side of tennis nobody posts about on social media. It was there, far from home, far from the tropical heat of Manila, that Eala built the game that would eventually announce itself to the world. First quietly, then loudly. In 2021, when she became the first Filipina to win a match on the WTA Tour, a milestone that in most countries would be a footnote, but in the Philippines, a nation of more than 110 million people with almost no modern tennis infrastructure and a sporting culture built around basketball courts on every street corner and boxing rings in every gym, was seismic. The kind of moment that gets replayed on national television. The kind of moment parents point to when telling their kids that anything is possible, even if your country has never produced a name in this sport before. Then in 2022, she added another layer to that foundation, a junior Grand Slam title at the US Open. Proof the promise wasn't a fluke. Proof the academy worked, and that the years away from home, the sacrifice of a normal childhood, were paying off in a way that could be measured, documented, celebrated. From there, the story only accelerated, match by match, tournament by tournament, until by early 2026, she was standing in the main draw of the Australian Open for the first time in her career, no longer a promising junior tucked away in qualifying draws, but a genuine main draw competitor at one of the 4 tournaments that define the entire sport. And this is where the story intersects with Djokovic, because what happened next wasn't really about tennis in the traditional sense. It was about crowds, about attention, about the strange, beautiful chaos that happens when a nation that's never had a tennis hero suddenly gets one. The numbers tell part of the story on their own. The 2026 Australian Open recorded more than 101,000 spectators through its gates, breaking the previous record of just over 95,000 set the year before. There were plenty of reasons for that growth: ticketing changes, expanded grounds, rising global interest in tennis generally. But there's no honest way to tell the story of that attendance surge without mentioning Alex Eala's first-round match. A match she lost in straight sets to Alicia Parks. A match that, on paper, looks like nothing more than an early exit. Scorelines that suggest a one-sided contest. And yet that match became one of the most talked about moments of the entire tournament, not because of what happened on the court, but because of what happened around it. Lines formed outside court 6 long before the match even began, a smaller venue never designed to handle the kind of crowd that showed up that day. Filipino flags.
Chants.
Cheering so loud and constant that tournament officials and match umpires had to publicly address the noise. Because in a sport built on hushed silence during rallies, on polite applause after points, on an almost sacred respect for concentration, this was something different. A crowd behaving more like a football stadium than a tennis court, cheering faults, cheering unforced errors from Eala's opponent, cheering with a kind of raw, uncomplicated joy tennis purists aren't always used to. It would have been easy, so easy, for a champion like Djokovic to roll his eyes at that, to treat it as an inconvenience, a distraction from the serious business of championship tennis, the way some players quietly did. Instead, he did something that said a lot about how he sees the sport at this stage of his career. He defended it. He explained it.
He put it in context.
And in doing so, he gave Alex Eala something rankings can't buy: validation from the very top of the sport. When Djokovic sat down with reporters after his own second round win over an Italian opponent, he wasn't asked to comment on Eala in some scripted way. The topic came up naturally, in a broader conversation about crowd sizes and attendance records. Rather than deflect, rather than give a generic answer about how nice it is to see full stadiums, he leaned into specifics. He acknowledged noticing what was happening around Alex Eala. He described it as understandable, as something that made sense given where she comes from, a country that had never before produced a player of her caliber on the main tour, a country he called large, significant, hungry for a sporting hero in a discipline it had never claimed before. And by most accounts of what he said, he framed the whole situation, the ticketing issues, the overflow crowds, the noise complaints, not as a problem in the negative sense, but as what he called a good problem. A phrase that sounds simple, almost dismissive on the surface, but carries real weight given who's saying it. Because Djokovic has spent more than 2 decades inside the biggest arenas in the world. He's played in front of hostile crowds who wanted him to lose, supportive crowds who wanted him to win, indifferent crowds who barely knew who he was early in his career. And after all of that, after every kind of atmosphere tennis can produce, he looked at the chaos surrounding a first-round loser and, by most reports, essentially said, "This is good. This is what we want. This isn't a headache. This is the sport growing in real time in front of us." That framing mattered enormously, because it set the tone for how the rest of the tennis world talked about the Eala phenomenon in the weeks that followed. Instead of treating the crowd noise as an embarrassment or a discipline problem, the conversation shifted toward what it actually represented: a new fan base discovering tennis for the first time through a player who looked like them, sounded like them, came from where they came from. Djokovic reportedly went further than just defending the atmosphere. He addressed the logistical side too, acknowledging that maybe the scheduling could have been better, that a player generating this much interest maybe deserved a bigger court from round 1, instead a smaller show court built for lower-profile matches. But he balanced that with an important piece of context. Eala is still extremely young in tour terms, still working her way up the rankings, still landing in early rounds simply because of where her ranking currently sits and the scheduling pressures tournaments face, when dozens of matches are happening across many courts at once naturally push emerging talents onto smaller courts, no matter how much local interest they generate. In a strange way, Djokovic managed to do 2 things at once in that one press conference moment. He validated Eala's growing stardom while gently managing expectations about how quickly the infrastructure around her would catch up to the demand she was creating. That kind of nuanced, generous, big-picture thinking is what makes this story different from a typical viral sports moment, because so much of modern sports media thrives on simple narratives: hero versus villain, breakthrough versus flop. What Djokovic offered was something more mature, an acknowledgement that growth is messy, that new fan bases bring new behaviors that established sports don't always know how to absorb gracefully at first, that a country falling in love with a new athlete for the first time is going to look different from the polished, practiced fandom of countries with decades of tennis tradition. And rather than criticize that rawness, he celebrated it. essentially telling the tennis world, this isn't a bug. This is the sport working exactly as it should. New blood, new excitement, new noise. If you've been paying attention to the broader arc of tennis in recent years, this framing fits neatly into a pattern that goes well beyond Alex Eala alone. Tennis, more than almost any other global sport, has spent the last several years actively hunting for new stars from new countries, watching with real interest as players from previously untapped markets begin cracking into the top levels of the game. Every time that happens, whenever a player from a country without an established tennis pedigree breaks through, the sport gets a jolt of energy it badly needs to stay relevant against faster, louder, constantly refreshed entertainment competing for the same attention. Alex Eala represents exactly that kind of jolt for the Philippines. A country of well over 100 million people. A country with an enormous, passionate, famously loud diaspora spread across the Middle East, North America, and Europe. A country whose sporting identity has for decades been defined almost entirely by basketball and boxing. And now, for the first time in a meaningful way, tennis has a name Filipino families can rally around, a name Filipino kids can put on their bedroom walls, a name Filipino commentators can build entire broadcasts on. That's precisely the kind of cultural moment Djokovic recognized and named out loud, reportedly calling her the biggest tennis player that country has ever produced. A statement that isn't hyperbole so much as simple accuracy, since there's no realistic competing name in Philippine tennis history that comes close to what Eala has already reached at such a young age. Once you understand the scale of that cultural weight, the crowd behavior at the Australian Open makes complete sense. This wasn't just tennis fans watching a rising player. This was an entire diaspora experiencing representation in a sport that had never offered them any before. And representation like that produces a very specific, very intense kind of emotional energy, the kind that doesn't always follow the polite, restrained customs of traditional tennis crowds. Djokovic, to his credit, seemed to understand that emotional context immediately, rather than judging it against an old-fashioned rulebook. That understanding probably didn't come from nowhere. Djokovic himself, earlier in his career, was very much an outsider working his way into a sport dominated by wealthier tennis nations. Coming from Serbia, a country recovering from war and economic hardship, training on cracked courts and empty swimming pools converted into makeshift practice spaces because proper facilities simply didn't exist. In many ways, when Djokovic looks at Alex Eala and the wave of first-time tennis fans surrounding her, he may well be seeing an echo of his own beginnings. An athlete from a country not traditionally associated with tennis excellence, fighting to be taken seriously on the biggest stages, carrying the hopes of people back home who never had anyone to point to before. That shared experience, even if never explicitly stated in his comments, almost certainly informs the warmth with which he chose to talk about her. It's worth remembering, too, that this wasn't an isolated interaction. In the months following the Australian Open, Djokovic and Eala's paths crossed again, this time far from any tennis court, at the Laureus World Sports Awards, held in April at the Palacio de Cibeles in Madrid. One of the most prestigious ceremonies in global sport, gathering legends and rising stars from across every discipline under one roof for a single glamorous night. Djokovic, serving as a co-host for the ceremony, found himself once again in Eala's orbit, this time in a completely different setting. Red carpets instead of hard courts. Formal wear instead of match kits. Eala, embracing the moment with the same confidence that's defined her rise, shared a behind-the-scenes photo from the evening featuring herself alongside Djokovic and freestyle skiing star Eileen Gu, captioning it with a playful nod to being surrounded by greatness. A small, human, relatable moment that quickly circulated among tennis fans online, not because it revealed anything dramatic, but because it captured something genuine. A young athlete early in her career, sharing space with legends of multiple sports, clearly aware of the surreal nature of her own rapid rise. That image, small as it may seem in the grand scheme of professional sports, reinforced the same underlying theme Djokovic had already established months earlier at the Australian Open, that Alex Eala belongs in these rooms, on these stages, in these conversations, not as a token gesture toward growing the sport's global footprint, but because her results, her presence, and her impact have genuinely earned her that seat at the table. And of course, results matter here too. because none of this cultural or emotional weight would carry the same significance if Eala's on-court performances didn't back it up. Her career trajectory in 2026 tells exactly that story. A career of real highs and real lows, the kind of uneven, unpredictable rhythm that defines almost every young player working her way up the rankings. After that Australian Open exit, Eala kept competing across the tour, facing setbacks like an early exit at the Qatar Total Energies Open, where she fell to qualifier Teresa Valentova. A reminder that rankings and talent alone don't guarantee results on any given day, and a difficult first-round defeat at the Porsche Tennis Grand Prix in Stuttgart against Leylah Fernandez. A tough scoreline that speaks to how competitive every level of the WTA Tour has become. But interspersed with those setbacks came genuine breakthroughs too, most notably a headline-making run at the Abu Dhabi Open, where Eala pulled off a significant upset against higher-seeded opposition. The kind of result that silences any lingering doubt about whether the Australian Open crowd phenomenon was built on hype alone rather than substance. Setting a top seed on tour doesn't happen by accident. It requires exactly the kind of technical foundation, mental toughness, and competitive instinct that years at an academy like Nadal's are designed to build. Look at the full picture. The losses to higher-ranked, more experienced opponents, the sudden statement wins against seeded players, the constant travel between tournaments across continents, the media obligations, the growing weight of national expectation, and you start to understand just how demanding this stretch of her young career actually is. It's against that backdrop of genuine, hard-fought tennis development that Djokovic's comments carry even more weight. He wasn't praising a manufactured star built purely on social media buzz. He was acknowledging a real competitor navigating the brutally difficult transition from promising junior to established tour professional, a transition that has ended the careers of countless talented players who couldn't handle the physical, mental, and emotional demands of weekly competition against the best in the world. And if there's one thing Djokovic understands better than almost anyone alive, it's exactly how brutal that transition can be, having lived through it himself more than 2 decades ago, and having watched dozens of promising juniors fail to make that same leap over the course of his long career. So when he speaks about Eala with what sounds like genuine respect, rather than polite, diplomatic praise, it carries weight that few other endorsements in this sport could match. Tennis Unfiltered.